Anna Polszajski, who's a London-based award-winning material scientist, and took part in yesterday's great science share with Rose and the 10 schools. So Anna is a material scientist, but also a storyteller and workshop leader, and has worked with schools. In fact, we almost met when we were both talking to on a kind of practitioners day to secondary schools. And there was such excitement from the students that heard you that I then went and got your book. And also, that's the other thing that I hope you mentioned. So thanks for joining us, Anna, and handing over to you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks everyone for being here and for, getting involved in this. My role, I think on this panel, I'm going to talk to you from the perspective of a scientist working with schools. So as Daniel said, I've been working with schools as a scientist for a decade now. That has encompassed lots of different sorts of work, from delivering shows on stage and in the classroom with demos, like quite long form talks and shows, sort of an hour-long type thing with slides and all the rest of it, like flashes and bangs and liquid nitrogen and all that fun stuff. But I've also worked with schools as a mentor with older students who are wanting to meet someone that's been to university and get an idea of how they can get into science through that route. And I have most recently been running creative writing workshops with science classes as well, because as Daniel mentioned, I'm also an author. I've written a popular science book called Handmade, A Scientist's Search for Meaning Through Making, which was a sort of naive scientist's journey into the world of making and craft. And through that, I've got involved in some schools, workshops and teaching storytelling in the context of a science lesson. And I've also been teaching storytelling to physics teachers to try and get stories and creativity into physics lessons as well. So lots and lots of different areas of my work. Storytelling is, I guess, the backbone to all of that. And what I'm really fascinated in is being able to bring science and engineering to places or settings and audiences that are traditionally underserved, or in some way don't feel welcome in science, or don't feel permission to be involved in science and to get going with it. And of course, schools is a huge part of that. So today what I thought I would do is to reflect on my experiences as a scientist who's been working with schools in these various different ways, and to particularly focus on some of the challenges that I've encountered, and then reflect upon how open schooling can be a huge part of changing the sort of rut or the challenges that I found myself in. So challenge number one for me personally is that lots and lots of people, teachers, students, families don't know what material science is. Now, this is quite a me-specific problem. Material science is a relatively niche subject. One Welsh university that teaches material science at undergraduate a few years ago had less than 5 students apply to them. It's not taught as a subject on its own in the way that maths, physics, chemistry and biology are. Because it itself sits in between those subjects. It's sort of like the physics of materials and the chemistry of materials, and there's a bit of design technology in there as well. So material science often finds itself as a topic or a kind of sub little niche in those subject areas, but it's infrequently presented to students as a viable career option going forward. So that's one challenge, is just lots and lots of people don't know that material science is a thing. Challenge number two is, for me, how to sell science and STEM to students. So the question that's plagued me throughout my career as a relatively public-facing scientist is, why should anyone care about this? Just because I think material science is the coolest thing ever? That's not a good enough reason for standing up in front of people and expecting them to care about what I've got to say. So throughout my career, I've called upon tools from the world of story and storytelling in order to help answer that question of why should people care, it means using narrative and story structure and creating vivid worlds and characters that enliven the stories of science. None of the science that I ever talk about is there because it's a fun fact. It's there because it's part of the narrative. We have to have it, as part of the story. And some of the approaches that I've taken have been to have in this story, to use myself and my story as a protagonist, to demonstrate from the point at which my audience are, from the age and the situation that they're sitting in, telling my story and showing them what's possible if they choose a scientific approach, if they choose a scientific career. So that's problem number 2, how to sell material science to students. Question number 3 is how to measure the impact of working with a school. Because most often an external scientist will come in and work with a school for an hour or 2, maybe half a day if you're lucky, and then they go home again. And they don't get to see the longevity of that lesson or that interaction. So you're often relying on teachers and family of the students to help interpret what they've seen, to make it relevant to what they've seen. And those teachers need the support to do so. The impact of scientists interacting with schools can often be on the timescales of months and years down the line before that impact, really becomes apparent. So that's a challenge then for me as a scientist to understand whether what I'm doing is the right thing, to get the feedback and to understand how to measure the impact going forward. Challenge number 4 is to do with access and equal opportunities. I work as a freelancer, so I don't have a university affiliation. I don't have a salary that is paid for by someone else that would allow me to come and spend time in schools. So that means that almost all the time I have to charge a fee in order for me to be able to put the time into developing materials and delivering materials, which of course poses the huge access and equal opportunities dilemma, because that means that lots of schools and students won't have access to that sort of thing. So the way that I've generally come around that problem is to speak at events that have an economies of scale model. There are companies like Education in Action and GCC Science Live that congregate many schools together in a big venue and bring scientists in to talk to them at scale. And that provides a model that means that I can afford to do that sort of work, and it means that I'm not out of pocket at the end of it. So there's a tricky thing there about being able to remunerate scientists for their time if they're people like me who don't have an institutional salary to fall back on. The problem though with those big events is that because they are so vast, you don't get the type of quality of interaction that you would in a small group in a classroom. We're talking scales like hundreds, sometimes thousands of students on any one particular day. So that's a real challenge, is how to make sure that you're allowing equal opportunities, but also being able to have those more one-to-one interactions. And then the final challenge is one of network, because the vast majority of schools that I end up working with are people who are already in my own professional and personal network. They contact me because they've heard me through Twitter or through my book or through my other online content, or they're, like I say, part of my professional network already. It can be really hard to connect with schools beyond my immediate circle, beyond teachers that spend time on Twitter and that spend time in circles that I exist in. So that's a big challenge, is how to expand that network and meet people that I would be able to work with. However, this is where I think the open schooling approach can help to solve all of these problems. So if we think about the hands-on nature of this, material science specifically, like I've said, is a very interdisciplinary subject. So these sorts of approaches then that are interdisciplinary by nature, that have to call upon different parts of the curriculum in order to solve a scientific problem, that is like material science gold. That's exactly the sort of thing that will help scientists like me to get our message out there. Selling it to students in terms of the story that they go on, the brilliant thing about this is that the students sell it to themselves. So it's really easy for scientists because they're already on board with it. They're already part of the scientific process themselves. So there is no big sell needed from someone like me because they're already doing it. The support to measure the impact, the support of networks, the support for access and equal opportunities, all of these things are really, really helped by these types of networks and these types of approaches. So with that, I'll stop there. That's been my perspective as a scientist, and I'm
Really
looking forward to
chimed
hearing
with
from the
so
rest of the
many.
panel.
Thank you, Anna. It really, first of all, it's great to hear that it sounds like there is an affinity between in terms of the approach, but we really have that same experience of trying to reach people beyond our existing networks, and that's where partnerships come in.
Yeah.
In a big time, and also organizations such as the one that Malcolm Grove leads. So we're going to move to Dr. Malcolm Groves, who's worked at the forefront of educational innovation for, I'd say, more than most of us, and embracing the whole range from primary to secondary and youth work and adult education. So it's a great pleasure to invite you, Malcolm, to reflect on the relationship of this idea of open schooling with your work, but also to share with us your latest